Hi, everybody. So in this video, we're going to be looking at controls, and these are government controls on prices and quantities. And because sometimes governments look at what a market produces in terms of the quantity or in terms of the price, and they make a decision that says, in the best interest of fairness, we're going to change the rules of the market a little bit, right? So for these, there will be the government intervening to try to change something about the price or the quantity. So let's get started. The first type of price control is a price ceiling. So there are two types of price controls. There's price ceilings and price floors. And this is a maximum price, right? The maximum price in the market. And so the government says that you're not allowed to buy and sell higher than a certain price. So even if you wanted to transact at $12, you're only allowed to sell it for 10, right? So that's the idea here. It benefits some consumers. So we'll kind of say that, right? It benefits certain buyers, and it hurts others, we should note, but it benefits certain buyers. And it will give you a couple of examples like rent control in New York City, or price gouging bans after natural disasters, right? So sometimes there will be like a ban on, you can't sell bottled water for more than a certain price and things like that. Now, some effects I've gone ahead and listed there, but I'll say here that you have shortages, right? That's the idea that if you tell the sellers that they can't charge above a certain price, then you're not going to induce them to produce enough to satisfy the market demand. We'll actually look at that in the graph in a second. There's also something called allocative inefficiency. Allocative inefficiency. And this is particularly acute among buyers. So this is the idea. Allocative inefficiency means that the market is not able to allocate the thing to the people who most are willing and able to pay for it. So thinking about like the people who most value the product aren't necessarily going to end up with it in these scenarios. Because think about like a price gouging ban on bottled water, it would just be the person who shows up first in line. So it's a different allocation mechanism than what the market does, where the market allocates it to people who value it the most and who are most willing and able to pay for it. This is a different allocation system. It's first come, first serve. And when we run out, we run out. So that's a different kind of system in the market. And we call this inefficiency because it's not allocated them efficiently according to the market. We also waste resources because some people are going to end up with it who don't really value it. So you'll have scenarios where people will be, well, I'm the first in line to buy the toilet paper, so I'm going to buy it all up, right? And so that's another issue with these. We already said that there's too small of a quantity. That's the shortages idea, but there's also too low of quality. And that's the idea that, think about that landlord in New York City, in New York, who's not allowed to charge higher than a certain rent. Well, they're not going to improve the property, right? There's no reason for them to do so because they can't financially benefit. And then last, it creates black markets. And those are illegal markets where transactions happen without any regulatory approval. And so possibly you end up with safety issues and all sorts of things. And that does happen as well in situations with price ceilings. So let's take a look at the graph. We're going to put this off to the side here and say quantity and price. And we have downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply. And normally the market price would be here. And at that market price, you would have Q star equilibrium. But what we find happens with a price ceiling is the government says, well, you wanted, and this can be easier if you maybe put a number here, you wanted to transact at $12. Well, you're not allowed to. You're only allowed to transact here at price maximum. And that's max. I know that's a little hard to see. And we'll say that's like $10. And so the market is like pushing up higher. It's like, oh, I want to get higher, but I can't get higher than $10. And at that $10 price, we find that sellers are only willing to quantity supply this much, right? That's the supply curve price, or the supply price is sometimes what we call it. So we're going to say QS, the quantity supplied. And then way over here at $10, that's the amount that people actually want to buy at $10. And that's quantity demanded. And so there's a difference between these two. And that difference is the shortage. Right? And a shortage is when the quantity demanded is bigger than the quantity supplied. Okay, so now let's take a look at a price floor, and it's pretty similar. It's just the reverse, right? This is a minimum price, and we often would say it benefits some sellers, right? And again, it's not going to benefit all the sellers because some aren't going to be able to sell, as we'll see. Just like in the first one, it didn't benefit all the buyers. Some of the buyers, they're no longer able to buy, right? There's not as much as there used to be. There used to be Q star, and now there's QS, and so forth. These examples of these would be like a minimum wage. And so this is a complicated topic, the minimum wages, and this is our first little toe dip into it. We're going to come back to the minimum wage later and see why maybe a price floor like a minimum wage, where you say, oh, you can't go below this price. It's maybe not as, it doesn't maybe produce the same effect that this model is going to suggest. So we're going to return to minimum wages. But there are some other ones as well. Certain farm products like milk and dairy have had minimum prices, so that basically if you're a dairy farmer and the price fluctuates too much, right, you'll get out of the business. So in order to make sure that dairy farmers are still producing, in the United States, we have minimum prices actually. And you don't necessarily see it in the grocery store, but it's actually way before them in the supply chain. Before the 1980s, we also had airline tickets that had these as well. And that was a really interesting time. Before the 1980s, air travel had minimum prices. And so if you wanted to hop on an airplane and go from New York to LA, you had to pay a really high price. The minimum price was set quite high. And we'll talk about what the effects are. So you end up with surpluses, right? Because if there's a high minimum price, then there's extra produced. We also have allocative inefficiency, because some sellers are going to be able to sell. Allocative inefficiency, let me finish this, among the sellers, because some sellers are going to be able to sell and others won't. At this really high price, there's not going to be very many buyers. So you're going to have lots of sellers chasing very few buyers. And so some of the sellers are going to find a buyer, but the sellers who find the buyers aren't necessarily the ones who are the most efficient producers. They may be ones who just got lucky, who happened to meet a buyer before somebody else did. So again, it's the same idea as what we talked about up here. Wasted resources, once again, because in this circumstance, right, you're producing way too much. And this is kind of a strange way to think about it, but the idea is actually too high of a quality. Because if you're a seller in this environment, and you know that there are very few buyers out there because the price has been set by the government to be so high, then what you have to do is compete on other things besides price. So this is how, back in the old days of air travel, people used to go on airplanes and they'd have these enormous seats, and you would have this amazing food, and they would treat you like royalty, and they would have these wonderful like extra perks and things and clubs and all that. And then after the 1980s, the government got rid of these regulations in many cases, and they opened it up, they deregulated it. And so the price of air travel fell, but at the very same time, the quality of air travel fell. And there's a lot of people that lament that. Let me pause for a second and say, it's really not that bad, because if you wanted to travel from St. Louis to New York 50 years ago, it was incredibly expensive to do it on an airplane. And nowadays, tons of people can fly. So the number of people who can actually fly to one place to another, because the price has fallen to be much lower, is a larger quantity. Now, granted, the quality is lower, but if you really wanted to, you could pay that former price, right? That really high price. You could pay that. You could get first class tickets. It used to be just that everybody basically was treated like a first class flyer, but the prices were so high that they had to compete on things like quality. So there are also black markets, right? And that's another one that will happen. There are people who will say, well, I'll work under the table for $5 an hour in cash because of the minimum wage. And so if you set a minimum wage to be too high, right, you will end up with some black markets in labor, and that could be quite dangerous. So let's take a look at the graph. Okay, and we'll see what happens here. And you have a demand, and you have supply, and you have some equilibrium price and quantity. But then in this one, we're going to set the price floor up here, right? We're going to say, well, you want this market price. You want this market price here. Well, too bad. And if you really want to think about it, right, you could say the market price maybe is $12, but the minimum the government says is 14. And so at $14, there's not very much demand for this product. You can see the quantity demanded is quite low, but at $14, there's a ton of sellers out there. So the quantity supplied is larger. And so we'd say those mean you have a surplus. And that's to say quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. Now, in a normal market, the surplus and that shortage would just disappear fairly quickly as basically the sellers and the buyers are pressured to go back to this equilibrium by the forces of the market. But in this situation, you're stuck with a surplus. So actually what governments have to do, right, and when I talked about the dairy farmers, is the government actually has to buy up the surplus. They have to buy the extra cheese and the extra milk. And they use it in military services, they use it in prisons, and they provide it to schools. So that's how the government actually maintains that high price for dairy products to make sure that dairy farmers don't go out of business. So again, we're benefiting some here, but it's also maybe producing some inefficiencies. Now we're going to take a look at the last thing here, and this is quantity controls. So quotas are a maximum quantity. And there's only one of these types of controls, right? We don't usually have minimum quantities set up. There's usually just a maximum. So that's kind of nice. You don't have a quantity floor, you have a quantity maximum. And so the way that they do it is they usually restrict the number of people who are allowed to sell. That's actually how the government normally does this. They'll say, we're going to issue 50 licenses for people to grow medical marijuana. That's a really common one right now. Or we'll issue, 5,000 taxi cab licenses, but no more. And we don't want to be overrun with too many car sharing and that kind of thing. Or we'll say there's only so many pounds of fish that you can catch. And they'll monitor how much you can bring in. So they restrict the quantity and they issue licenses. Now they function by kind of driving a wedge between the demand and the supply price, and we'll see that here in a second. But so I don't quite. I'll just go ahead and I'll show you the graph. That'll be easier to explain some of these here, and then we can go back and talk through these. Quantity, price. It's easier with the graph, almost always, right? Give me just. And so for these, you've got a price that the market wants, and you've got this quantity that the market is pushing for. But in these, sorry, my dog keeps wanting to join me in this lecture video. In these, you're just going to draw a vertical line like that, and you're going to say this is the quantity maximum. And you can also call that just the quota, right? So you might say the market wants to have 100 of, I don't know, but any one of those things, right? Number of taxi cab licenses or marijuana growers or whatever. But the government says you can only have 80. And so it drives a wedge between these 2 points on the supply curve and on the demand curve. Now at this quantity, 80, if you're telling the buyers we're only going to make 80 of these, then the buyers are actually willing to pay quite a high price for that, for 80 of these. So this is what we sometimes call the demand price. And it's the price paid by the buyers. That's the price that the buyers pay. Now, to produce 80 of these, you're not going to have the price be very high on the supply curve to induce the sellers to produce 80. So they don't really need that high of a price to produce. That's the price that the sellers would be willing to do this for. But notice that they don't get PS. They don't get P star. They actually get what the price the buyers are willing to pay is. Because if you're a seller and you're like, hey, there's only 80 medical marijuana growers and I'm the lucky one of them, you're not going to be like, well, I'm just going to lower the price to my minimum willingness. No, you'll charge what the buyers are willing to pay. In that case, that's PD, price paid. So that functions by putting a wedge, right, is a way to think about this. Wedge between the price of the demand and the price of the suppliers, right? The supply price and the demand price. And we talk about that wedge because it's an important difference. It's the difference between what the seller's willing to do it for and what they get. And that added benefit of what they get is what we call quota rent. So quota rent is the extra, the added benefit from being able to sell, to sell under the terms of the quota. So like if you're one of those lucky, you know, marijuana growers or one of those lucky taxi cab drivers or whatever, and you have a license to do it, you're lucky because you can charge that extra high price. Now on a per unit basis, it's just the difference. So I'm just going to draw like a little arrow and say the per unit is price demand minus price supply. So it's the difference between this price and this price. That's the per unit. But the total amount of benefit that goes to all the sellers, you can add up the size of this box. And that's the total. So the box, the area of the box, is actually the total amount of quota rent that all the different sellers get to benefit from. So you can see how that certain sellers would be really excited. Now, certain sellers would not be, right? There would also be some sad sellers. And there's the idea there of allocative inefficiency. We'll talk about that. It's actually, in these cases, it's allocative inefficient for both buyers and sellers, because some sellers, right, are not going to be able to sell. There's going to be some who are left out in the cold who didn't get a license. At the same time, there are buyers on the demand curve, these buyers, right, on the demand curve, who used to be able to get the product are no longer willing and able to pay that very high price. And so they're not getting the product anymore. So it's not allocating it directly to them as well. We also have black markets, right? You have that as well. Okay, so I know this was a long one, but I hope that it helps. I'll see you next time.